Chapter 12. Bombing Development Unit, R.A.F. Feltwell. During my leave, at the end of my tour of ops, I was sick with serious laryngitis and was unable to return to my unit for an extra 2 weeks. When I did return to Chedborough, the squadron continued to be busy on operations in support of the Allied armies, who had now moved further towards Germany and up to the River Rhine. They were also still hitting targets of a strategic nature, as before and whenever possible. I had to wait around until a new posting came along and, meantime, helped give support to the crews still operating. A new policy on the length of tour had increased the number of ops up to 35, and this had been announced the day after we completed our 30 ops. Johnny O'Brien and his crew were caught this way as they had only done about 28 or so. So we were lucky to have been able to avoid the extra burden of another 5 ops. It's not that we wouldn't have minded if we had known earlier in the tour, but to gear yourself and your family to expect completion at 30 ops and then have it changed so late would have put an awful strain on everyone. I received a call to go to Bombing Development Unit at R.A.F. Feltwell for an interview with the CO Wing Commander Dickie Spears. I've found him to be a delightful and assuming person. Highly decorated with a DSO and DFC, the interview went well and he confirmed that I was suitable for the appointment as a staff pilot for the unit. It was a very good posting to get, as the unit flew a variety of aircraft developing new bomber equipment. These new developments were eventually to be used on bomber squadron aircraft and led me into some very interesting flying. In the event, I joined the unit on the 26th of March, 1944. When I reported to the adjutant Flight Lieutenant Henry Williams, who was a well-known actor on the New York stage in civilian life. He had come over to do his bit by joining the R.A.F. subsequently. After he was demobbed, he made a film in England, 29 Acacia Avenue, with a leading role, and then went back to New York where he took the lead in Shaw's Pygmalion, which readers will recall is the origin of the musical My Fair Lady. Henry was a modest, very debonair, beautifully spoken Englishman as one would expect, and he made me most welcome. The day was to have a dramatic and sad outcome. I was sitting in the mess after lunch when a call came for me to contact the telephone exchange urgently. It was my brother telling me my father had died suddenly that morning. I was deeply shocked and the CO gave me his condolences and sent me on 7 days leave at once. I rang Gladys in Carnarvon and she agreed to come to London as soon as possible. On reaching home in London, I learned that my father had died of cancer, but his illness had been kept from me because I was on ops. I had, however, noticed that he had not been well when I had been to London to see the family 2 months earlier on a short leave pass. My father had died on his 60th birthday and I found my mother deeply distraught when I reached home. He had worried so much about me when I was on ops that I think it hastened his death. Apparently, he used to go into the garden at night when he heard bombers going out and he would say, "I wonder if young George is on tonight." He would sleep badly and then go out in the garden again when he heard the bombers return and he would say, "I hope young George is back safely." He and I shared the same love of sport and animals, and he had a great sense of humor and always had a fund of stories. These characteristics are very much in my own makeup. The awful thing was that due to shortages of medical staff, my brother and I had to lay him out. It was a devastating experience, for not only was it the first time I had handled a dead body, it was also my father. After the funeral, Gladys returned to Carnarvon and I went back to Feltwell. The various delays after I finished my ops and started flying again ended on the 5th of April. My first flights at BDU were conversion to the Handley Page Halifax Mark III, another 4-engined bomber which No. 4 Group were equipped with. I found the Halibag, as it was affectionately known, a lovely aircraft to fly and much quieter than the Lancaster, due to its radial engines. I still loved the Lang most of all though. BDU was a very interesting unit, as most of the flying staff, apart from myself, were ex-No. 138 Squadron, which Wing Commander Spears had commanded. The squadron was quite unique in its operations. It was equipped with short Sterling bombers, plus a few Lysanders, and carried the out most secret operations, dropping supplies to the Dutch, French and Belgian resistance fighters. The Lysanders actually landed in fields in France, dropping off and picking up secret agents. The BDU staff, not surprisingly, were the most highly decorated staff of any unit I had ever served with, having won a massive awards while serving on 138 Squadron. I wondered how on earth I got the job at that stage. I did not have one single decoration. They were a marvelous bunch to be with and made me very welcome. They were, however, as tight as clams about their operational experiences, which had to remain very secret. Even within the R.A.F. it was well after the war before I really learned the nature of the clandestine operations that they had carried out, and with such bravery. What I did gain was the privilege and knowledge gained by working with such highly qualified and experienced operators. The ability of the navigators on the unit in finding their way with only a map was quite outstanding. BDU was tasked with testing and developing all sorts of equipment, which included new forms of radar, radios, armament, and window. In fact, anything but that was eventually to go into bombing command aircraft. The flight commander I served under was a squadron leader, Paddy Roy, an Irishman with lots of charm and ability to go with it. One piece of radio equipment did not work too well, however, for it caused a fire on board in the electrical panel and we had to put it out and do an emergency landing at base. As the navigator opened the smoking panel, a sheet of flame shot out. The panel was situated just in front of the main crossfade fuel pipes on the Lancaster we were flying, so it was a highly dangerous situation. We were all mighty relieved when we got down safely. One spin-off was that the very experienced crew were most complimentary on how I handled the situation, and it stood me in good stead with my new unit. I enjoyed being back at Feltwell, a peacetime pre-war airfield with excellent facilities, in terms of buildings, hangars and accommodation. Although the airfield was a grass one, the takeoff runs were up to 2,000 yards in most directions and, therefore, quite adequate for our operations. Surprisingly, we had very few delays due to airfield surface condition, for it seemed to be generally dry and well drained. It was also a very good source of mushrooms when in season. The officers' mess was excellent and fortunately I was able to share a room with an old chum from my Landerog days. Flying Officer Jock McCall had earned one of the first Distinguished Flying Medals of the war, earning his decoration whilst flying on Wellingtons of No. 9 Squadron. He was, like me, also married to a Carnarvon girl. The other coincidence was that No. 9 Squadron and BDU had both operated from the famous Newmarket racecourse. The course was taken over as a bomber base when war broke out, because of a unique feature. The course had a mile-long straight called Rowley's Mile and this provided a perfect grass runway. The Halifax aircraft on BDU were equipped mainly with the new types of improved H2S radar. The radar that gave a map definition on a screen in the aircraft from signals sent out and received back into the aircraft equipment. A radar revolving scanner was fitted into a compartment under the belly of the aircraft. BDU trained squadron navigators in the use of the equipment and we flew on night navigation sorties to develop their training and skills in its use. The rest of our work was flying Lancasters and the testing of all the other varied sorts of new equipment. Virtually, every trip was a different one and therefore very interesting. In addition, the unit also had liaison aircraft in the form of an Oxford and an Anson. The war in Europe was now moving rapidly towards its close as the German armies surrendered to the Allied forces in ever-increasing numbers on all fronts. Expectation arose in May that the war in Europe was almost over. On the 7th of May, my roommate, Jock McCall, who had access to important signals, told me that Prime Minister Winston Churchill was to go on radio later that day officially declare the end of the war in Europe and that a 48-hour stand-down was to be given to all personnel who could be spared. I was, therefore, able to obtain permission to get home to Gladys in Carnarvon to celebrate what became known as VE Day. The 8th of May, 1945, I got home to Carnarvon to Gladys and Valerie, and it was a joy and surprise to all family in Wales for me to be home on that day. It was a very memorable occasion when the announcement was made by Churchill and practically everyone all over Europe swarmed into city centres to celebrate. Carnarvon was no exception, and as usual in Wales, such celebrations led to the wonderful Welsh voices singing with love and joy. A group of us went on to the top of Small Mountain, Teatil, overlooking the city, and it was quite magical as the sound of the singing floated up from Castle Square. We were all finding it hard to believe that the war was really over. Now the men and girls would all be coming home and prisoners of war in Europe able to return. There was, of course, a cloud over it all, and that was the Far East War, and that was still far from over. The excitement all over, I returned to Feltwell wondering what would happen next. I was fortunate to be able to carry on flying, and BDU still had much work to do. There was a plan to send a bomber force to the Far East known as the Tiger Force. They would still need the best equipment they could have, and that was our task to carry on developing any new and improved equipment. With the end of the war in Europe, it was, of course, possible for a great deal of restrictions to be lifted at once, air raid precautions, blackouts and other similar regulations. I was able to go home again late in May for a weekend pass. To my surprise, Gladys and her family greeted me with congratulations on my being awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross for my efforts on ops. The local paper already had my name listed, and Gladys had been told about it by the lady in the newspaper shop. The following day I received a congratulations telegram from BDU. A trip was made to the local military tailors and the ribbon was soon proudly sewn on by Gladys. It was a time of great pride for all my family and a tribute to my crew as well, for it symbolized all our efforts. Early in June it was announced that Bomber Command would have a number of new tasks. Bombers would be used to bring home released prisoners of war from Germany. A further operation was ordered to carry food to the people of Holland, Belgium and other countries who were near starving. A third, but very interesting operation, was ordered called Operation Baedeker, after the famous German touring guidebook. This was to enable us to take the aircraft on cross counties over the devastated areas of Germany and to carry ground personnel, including WAFs, to see the bomb-damaged cities. Resulting from the efforts of the aircraft and crews of Bomber Command which they had supported. We, as aircrew, had not seen what we had done either, not from low level or at leisure. These trips usually lasted about 4 or 5 hours and we were flown at a height of 20,000 feet, to give easy viewing. We often went a bit lower than that, of course, and really everyone had a good look at the horrific damage the Allied bombers had inflicted. Mostly, we went to see devastated rural cities. As an example, the first one I did was in Halifax over the following route: West Capelle, Holland, Flushing, Mönchengladbach, the scene of my last op, Cologne, Solingen, Hamm, Dortmund, Essen, Duisburg, Wesel, Feltwell. These were amazing trips, for the extent of the damage astonished us, really impressing us with the punishment inflicted on the Germans and their country. In hindsight, it has always amazed me how quickly they recovered from such devastation. We continued these flights for several months, and my final one in October was marked with the honor of taking the station commander along when, apart from the Ruhr cities, we went on to the Mondam of Donbass to fame. Group Captain Darcy Grieg was a famous R.A.A.F. pilot, having been in the team of distinguished officers who pre-war had won the Schneider Trophy outright. This trophy was competed for over many years before the war by a number of air forces, including the German and Italian air forces. Britain won it flying the Supermarine seaplane SE-5. This aircraft was designed by R.J. Mitchell, who designed the Spitfire, which was derived from the SE-5. Group Captain Darcy Grieg congratulated me on my flying, a compliment I shall always treasure from such a famous R.A.F. pilot. After the European war ended, life at Feltwell became really great fun. Apart from the excellent and varied range of flying, we enjoyed a very good social life. Jock McCall and I still shared a room, and we both loved listening at night to a program from the American Forces Network with the famous signature tune Skyliner. The station played continuous popular music by all the big bands: Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw, Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey and Benny Goodman, all with their famous vocalists. Of course, BBC also played these along with the beloved Vera Lynn, the Force's sweetheart, today known as Dame Vera Lynn and still loved by all us ex-servicemen. Sport also began to become more and more prevalent, and stations could now play teams against one another again. There were still a large number of top sportsmen in the services awaiting demobilization, who meantime, played for their stations. Our room was on the second floor of the mess overlooking the sports fields. I remember watching some great games of cricket and soccer of a very high standard. Feltwell's stars were 2 West Indian cricketers who became test players, an Aussie who played for Victoria in soccer. Chris Duffy, who scored the winning goal for Charlton in the 1947 FA Cup final at Wembley, which I personally went to see. Gradually, I renewed my own sporting activities and began playing soccer, cricket and athletics again, though several years of booze and cigarettes had not done much for my fitness. The old joke, "Are you fit, or air crew?" came home to me. About this time my health was not too good, for whenever I got a cold it always went on my throat and I got severe laryngitis. It got so bad I had to have my tonsils out in Ely R.A.F hospital, in those days a very painful operation after it had been done. It helped to end my smoking, which I have never done since. One of our pilots, who had married a Canadian girl, was living in a house at Feltwell, and he invited me to bring Gladys down for a stay. Gladys' family looked after Valerie and we had 3 very pleasant weeks in Feltwell. We all enjoyed visiting the local pubs and especially, the Oak, a pub in the village itself. When I was on sick leave after the tonsillectomy, victory over Japan was announced, following that dramatic dropping of the world's first atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It all seemed to end so suddenly in the event, and became something of an anticlimax. What looked as if it could have become a long and bitter struggle, with thousands of Allied troops being lost if an invasion of the Japanese mainland had taken place, just abruptly ended. I was recovering well, helped by a beautiful spell of weather and enjoying lots of visits to the beaches near Carnarvon. I also became more and more enchanted with Valerie, now aged 18 months, a real little tomboy. The next few months at Feltwell enabled me to get in lots of flying, in a variety of aircraft. Gradually, old faces were beginning to disappear as chaps were on their way out of the services and into Civvy Street. Of course many went into the now developing post-war airlines. Meanwhile, I had applied to stay in the R.A.A.F, although I had begun studying for the required civil aviation qualifications. However, whilst permanent commissions were hard to come by, the R.A.A.F introduced a scheme of extended service commissions for up to 4 years and I was delighted to be accepted. Always hoping that eventually I could obtain a permanent career in the R.A.A.F. As the winter of 1945 approached, we were told that a new unit was to be formed under the title of Central Bomber Establishment. This was being formed at R.A.F Marham, near King's Lynn in North Norfolk. The unit was to have 2 main wings, a tactics wing and a development and training wing, and BDU was to be absorbed into the latter. I had enjoyed my time at Feltwell as we changed over from war to peacetime. The flying had been rewarding and I had flown several types of aircraft, thereby widening my experience. Aircraft types I had flown, apart from the Lancaster and Halifax, were the Vickers Warwick, derived from the Wellington, the first Arvo Lincoln. An advanced version of the Lancaster, more on the Lincoln in the next chapter, and the Percival Proctor, a 4-seater liaison aircraft. In the next chapter I will also describe in more detail the various types I was now about to fly. My next few years were now settled and I would have 4 more years at least to serve.